is no path. Beyond the scope of light, beyond the reach of dark, and yet we seek it insatiably. Such is our fate.
It is your choice to embrace or renounce this. Great Sovereign, take your throne.
But the question remains, what do you want? Tell me. Light, dark, or something else entirely?
What lies ahead, only you can see.
What could possibly await us?
What makes a true king? We often see a cycle of light and dark reflected through the lineage of leaders throughout the ages. One may rule in an age of prosperity, beloved by their people. Another might usher in a new age of their totalitarian grip. Another might reluctantly refuse the responsibility altogether. Ages and rulers come and go. Dust resettles and clears to make way for the continuation of the status quo or something else entirely. A ruler or monarch takes on a different meaning or weight in the lands between and Drang Lake. Here in these lands specifically, being a ruler means taking on the burden of the world and its people. Renown, blood, and lineage mean little in these ever-changing worlds. Here we turn to the lowest of status, class, and fame in a desperate attempt to breathe new life into a tug-of-war of light and dark, or replace the former ruler who has become a husk of their former selves. The throne awaits and will accept you to make the choice free from outside influence. These dying worlds only ask that you carry the responsibility of lordship on your shoulders so that you may keep the torch lit, let it fade, or present an alternative. What do you want, truly? Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Elden Ring is Dark Souls 2 series. When looking at the end goal of both games, they heavily differ from other FromSoft titles. Instead of simply feeding a cycle, we take on a greater responsibility, which is rulership. The concept of ending Dark Souls 2 as a ruler has been revamped in Elden Ring's endings, creating some very compelling parallels. It is often regarded that Elden Ring is Dark Souls 2 too, so we are bringing the discussion to how both games similarly handle rulership, individuality, and their respective endings. What separates these games from others in the series of Souls and spin-offs is that they specifically put the player in the position of leadership by the end game. The other titles often see the player simply sacrificing themselves in order to continue the cycles of light and dark. Elden Ring and Dark Souls 2 touch on these themes, but have had an added component of leadership/lordship to their endings and overall themes. Arguably, this places an even greater sense of importance on the player because not only are they expected to bring about the continuation of cycle or alternatives, but also oversee those ages as a ruler. In DS1 and 3, we are often seeing ourselves sacrificing our lives in preservation or service to the ritual of continuing light or dark. While the dark endings present greater sense of urgency in those games, they do not show or encourage the leadership of the player to the same extent as the endings of DS2 and Elden Ring. The most obvious visual representation is that both games see the player sitting on a throne at the end game or making the choice to pursue something outside of the cycles taking place in Drang Lake and the lands between. In addition to playing a heavy emphasis or influence on the idea of being a ruler, both games have specific definitions or meanings of what it means to be a ruler. Being a ruler in both of these lands does not involve how well one governs or manages the economy of these lands, but rather the willingness to place the world on their shoulders and carry those burdens. The prime representation of this in Dark Souls 2 is through Vendrick's story. In Dark Souls 2, Vendrick is often referred to as not being a true monarch by both Aldia and Nashandra. Nashandra states that Vendrick never took the true throne, and Aldia mentions him as a near-true monarch. Our encounters with these characters that knew Vendrick suggest that he may be the king of Drang Lake, but he is limiting his potential. The soul of the king also states that he was lacking vessel for the throne. The question is, what was he lacking? While not directly stated, it is heavily implied that Vendrick refused to light the first flame and continue the Age of Fire. He saw an alternative path while looking into the curse of the undead. He states that the true leader must inherit the fire and harness the dark, suggesting that the interplay between light and dark is pointless, and that a true ruler must understand and accept both. As he quotes, "Dark was seen as a curse. Shadow is not cast, but born of fire. And the brighter the flame, the deeper the shadow. Inherit the fire and harness the dark. Such is the calling of a true leader. One day, fire will fade, and dark will become a curse. Men will be free from death, left to wander eternally. Dark will be ours again, and in our true shape, we can bury the false legends of yore. Only is this our only choice. Seeker of fire, coveter of the throne, seek strength. The rest will follow." As stated earlier, the other titles emphasize more of what is within the parameters of the cycle instead of seeking alternatives out of it. According to Vendrick's dialogue with him when obtaining the crowns from the Lost Kings, a true leader must seek alternatives and seek strength, and the rest shall follow. Vendrick is stating that the tug of war between light and dark is not the only way of a true ruler, and that taking on the burden of responsibility to find other means is what makes a true monarch. The burden could be the choice of what to do next, and making a decision that is best for the world according to their individual selves rather than outside influence. More on that outside influence later. The idea of what it means to be a ruler is not as much of an overt theme as it is in DS2 in Elden Ring, with a plethora of item descriptions. Elden Ring instead indicates the meaning of leadership through the endings and overall actions the player must undertake and perform. In Elden Ring, the Tarnished is presented with multiple options when looking to shape and rule the world. There are, of course, endings that still play into the status quo, such as the Age of Fracture or the Age of Order. Both of these endings see you repairing or improving upon the established order in order to keep things relatively the same. These endings serve as putting a bandage on the open wound of the world. Other endings, like the Age of Despair and Dustborn, are slight alternatives to the status quo with an addition of specific affinities such as death from the Duskborn Age or the curse from the Age of Despair. These endings still essentially keep the world the same, with some slight alterations. The biggest divergences arise from the Age of Stars and the Age of Frenzied Flame endings. Here we see a much more radical shift, most notably being Ranni's consort in the former and purging all life from the lands between in the latter. Both of these endings do not see the Tarnished becoming a consort of Marika and repairing her in some way. Instead, a new leader is chosen in the form of Ranni, or the world is completely devoid of life if burned with the frenzy flame. These two endings operate very similarly thematically to the alternatives that could arise from the cycle, as Aldia suggests back in Dark Souls 2. These endings offer a more radical solution to the world's problems. These endings seek to operate outside of the cycle, which is what Aldia and to some extent Vendrick were alluding to in that game's respective world. The Tarnished has the choice to directly take on the burden of the world in several different ways. A true monarch, in the case of Elden Ring, is sitting upon the throne and making that choice. Aiding to this notion, Gideon will state at the start of his boss fight that Marika hopes that the Tarnished struggle for eternity. His armor also states that he glimpsed into the will of Marika and saw the end that should not be. Gideon, much like Aldia, is aware of the multiple outcomes of the world, but instead fears their possibility, whereas Aldia has a curiosity about those potential different outcomes. This further emphasizes the possibilities that come with being a ruler rather than a specific expectation to continue the world as it has been. Gideon fears the end that should not be, which could be any of the game's known endings or something else entirely. Being a ruler in the lands between is flipping the script on the push and pull of the world and seeking all possible options. Both Elden Ring and Dark Souls 2 present options to assume the role of leader in order to shape the world in one's image. A leader gets to make the choice rather than having the choice made or influenced upon them. A leader in these games takes on the weight of the world in similar ways versus simply sacrificing themselves or playing into the current cycle. The idea of choice is uniquely prevalent to both games in the series. A king or monarch is not simply a title but a duty to take on the weight of the world alone for the betterment of its people. Being Elden Lord or ruler of Drangleic have a unique meaning in that they ask the player to take on the burdens of the world, live with those burdens, and do so in order to usher in an age of their individual choice. A large theme throughout both of these games is the emphasis on the individual and the importance of the freedom of choice and what effect that has upon the player experience and the narrative events. Elden Ring and Dark Souls 2 play heavy emphasis on the idea of the player having the choice to determine the age of the world. In games such as DS1 and 3, there are often outside influences that muddy the decision-making process. DS1 has the influence of the primordial serpents, who are certainly withholding greater truths in order for their desired outcomes to be seen through. The theory of the serpents Frampt and Koth being the same is not too outlandish in my view, given how both will steer you to usher in an age of dark or an age of light, with little to no discussion for alternative or wiggle room. The subjectivity of what these cycles represent or do is not elaborated on. This isn't to say that this option or means of storytelling is less than, but different and has its own strengths. In Dark Souls 2, many characters may reference these concepts of light and dark, but ultimately they are presented as different sides of the same coin, meaning that either outcome really doesn't matter. To enforce this notion, Strait of Alophus states, "Many kingdoms rose and fell on this tract of earth. Mine by no means was the first. Anything that has a beginning also has an end. No flame, however brilliant, does not one day splutter and fade, but then from the ashes the flame reignites, and a new kingdom is born, sporting a new face. It is all a curse." This quote embodies the idea that whatever new kingdom arises will in many ways mimic the kingdoms of the past, making it simply a curse of repetition. This also hints at the binary options of DS1 and DS3 that remove any sense of individuality from the player character. The choices are limited in both games to highlight the lack of individualism the player character has, while in Elden Ring and Dark Souls 2 go in the opposite direction, to essentially uplift the player character's individualism as ruler of Drangleic and the lands between. In Dark Souls 2, the freedom of choice is presented by many characters, specifically Aldia and Vendrick. As previously noted, Vendrick suggests alternate ways of approaching the coming age beyond light and dark, but does so in a manner that is not as forceful as the serpents of DS1 or the system set by the burning of the Lords of Cinder in Dark Souls 3. Vendrick is merely making the suggestion rather than presenting the system as only the light and dark options. Aldia operates in similar fashion by offering another option in the game's ending. Aldia asks, "I lost everything, but remained here patiently. The throne will certainly receive you, but the question remains, what do you want truly? Light, dark, or something else entirely?" Here, Aldia is asking the player what they want versus planting influence on them to make their choice. He states that the throne will perfectly accept the bearer of the curse, but also that there are other options outside of the throne of one. That is a unique quality of DS2, where the player has the freedom to make their choice for the ending in the gameplay function, as well as the outside characters and how they interact with them. To make reference to this divergence of systems of light and dark in DS1, The Emerald Herald simply states in her first line of dialogue, "Are you the next monarch or merely a pawn of fate?" The player has been previously a tool in DS1, whereas here in Drangleic there is something more as an individual. The same freedom of choice that is removed from influence can be said for Elden Ring and its respective endings. While there are many characters that represent those options for the coming age, they too understand that it is your decision to make those critical choices. This is partially due to the consort system in place. In other words, these characters need you to agree with their philosophy in order to become their consort. This system does not allow for differences in opinion or aim. Marika and Godfrey's relationship is a great indicator of what happens when one consort's views misalign with that of the others. This is all to say that these characters like Fia, Dung-Eater, and Ronnie are not going to force you to bend to their wishes because they need you more than you need them in many aspects. This differs from the serpents of DS1, for example, where they will just wait for another chosen undead to show up and do their bidding with no questions asked. The increased agency and importance of the player in Elden Ring indicates that they have greater worth as an individual as they become Elden Lord. As Lord, the Tarnished is not a pawn of fate, and even has the choice to approach all of the endings at the end of a playthrough if desired, save for the Flame of Frenzy ending. By comparison, DS1 and 3 will often lock you out once you have progressed past a certain point, removing that sense of choice. Even an ending as grim as the Flame of Frenzy, there is very little resistance from outside influence. Melina will not fight you, for example, but simply abandon the Tarnished if embraced by the Three Fingers. The characters essentially leave the Tarnished to their own devices for the most part. The game and its themes present the player with the freedom of choice devoid of outside influence, even with the most extreme or quote-unquote evil endings on offer. To aid the idea of individualism for both games, the player represents the lowest form of life. The bearer of the curse is mocked at the start of the game by the Firekeepers, and the Tarnished is seen as lesser than by the likes of many characters such as Morgott and Godric. Gideon even states in his dying words that a man cannot kill a god, which plays on the idea that we in fact can, expressing the capabilities of the individual. Both games give the potential of rulership to the lowest of status. Thus they must rely on the individual deeds of those low life forms rather than inheritance or title. In other words, the lowest of life forms get to become rulers, where the lowest of life forms of DS1 and DS3 become kindling or become a Lord of Hollows while at the beck and call of outside influencers. The themes of Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring share a different approach, where the bearer of the curse and the Tarnished get to have a greater say in their choice of rule, as well as what follows within that age, or at the very least it is implied that freedom will be present after the credits roll. The fact that we end both games potentially on the throne also aids to the power of the individual and the importance of their choice, rather than simply being burned up or a pawn of someone else's desires. After looking at the themes and their depiction in both games, Elden Ring and Dark Souls 2 have a unique and specific way of viewing monarchy, what it means to be a ruler, and the importance of choice and individualism. With all of these very abstract and sometimes tightly interwoven concepts, feel free to let me know if I might have missed a bit of evidence from any item descriptions or dialogue. For this video, it's important to note that I do not find that any game in this series is better than the other in terms of storytelling. In fact, I like the individual differences between these titles, especially when it comes to the concepts of individualism and freedom of choice. Elden Ring and Dark Souls 2 take the approach where it works as a core theme, whereas that lack of individualism works well in the cases of DS1 and 3. In many ways, Elden Ring evolves on the concepts established in Dark Souls 2. It is hard to ignore the player's purpose and agency that both games showcase. I would have personally liked that theme to be a bit more overt in dialogue and character interactions in Elden Ring like it was in Dark Souls 2, but the endings really helped to drive home those concepts of that individual freedom very well. I am sure that Aldia would be very proud to see just how many options were available at the end of Elden Ring, for example. Feel free to let me know how you feel about the way rulership and individualism was handled in both titles in the comments, as well as what is your favorite ending and why. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked this video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. I appreciate you taking the time to check out this video and the channel, as well as sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Discourse and feedback is encouraged and welcome. And as a final side note, I would just like to call attention to the video done by Sinclair Lore and the Knight of the Orchards channel that discussed the idea of kingship in Dark Souls 2. That video served as the foundation for many of the ideas sparked when creating this video, so I highly recommend checking out both of those channels and that specific video, which I will link in the description below. Thank you again, and I will catch you all in the next one very soon. Take care.
Well then, shall we? My fair consort eternal.